Good evening, everybody. I'm very pleased to welcome you tonight and be moderating this event. I'm Sarah Abravias-Stein. I'm a professor of history here at UCLA and the Sadie and Ludwig Kahn director of the Alan D. Levy Center for Jewish Studies, which is a co-sponsoring unit of this event. And I'm really pleased that you have gathered with us tonight. So some words of introduction. Just a very short statement of context and to acknowledge the people who have worked so hard to pull this event together, and then we will begin. So, and I will be introducing my friends and colleagues momentarily. So we are so grateful that you are here to join us for a timely and sensitive and engaged scholarly conversation. And we carry out this conversation in the spirit of civil discourse and the goal of fostering a political dialogue that is respectful and productive and focused on understanding rather than division. And we are close colleagues with many scholarly ties between us, and so it will be really a delight to share the table tonight. As I know I don't have to remind anyone here, recent months have been marked by tremendous violence and pain and trauma and loss in Israel, in Gaza, in the West Bank, and across the global communities that are intimately tied to their fates. I think I can say that all of us on the stage tonight share a horror for the events of October 7th, on which day, as we know, Hamas carried out its devastating terrorist attack on Israel with 1,200 killed and roughly 250 kidnapped. And we also have a horror for the subsequent Israeli military assault in Gaza and the brutal displacement of 1.5 million Palestinians, the wounding of over 68,000, a death toll that now stands at over 28,000. As one of our speakers noted recently, the last 4 months have been really among the darkest of the entire conflict. This event is the second in a conversation between Dov Waxman and Ethan Katz. The first was convened at UC Berkeley on February 1st, and that focused on anti-Semitism on campus, on anti-Zionism on college campuses. So we will be sidestepping that topic tonight and focusing instead on the theme of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. And I should say a special welcome, not only those of you in this room, friends and colleagues and students, but those of you joining us over Zoom. Tonight, we carry this conversation forward with a focus on anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. I encourage you, if you have not viewed the filmed version of the first event, to look either at the Nazarian Center's website or the UC Berkeley Center for Jewish Studies website, and you can find it there. And they really are crucial companions to each other. Today's conversation is, of course, sponsored by the UCLA YNS Nazarian Center for Israel Studies and the UC Berkeley Center for Jewish Studies, co-sponsored by the Levy Center, as I mentioned, and the UC Berkeley Center for the Study of Religion and Center for Middle East Studies. So I'd like to move with those framing words, and also I want to say appreciation to the entire staff at the Nazarian Center who carried off this event so gracefully. And I'd like to introduce our guests. So first, to my right, is my colleague, Dov Waxman, of course, the director of the Nazarian Center, a professor of political science and the Rosalind and Arthur Gilbert Foundation Chair of Israel Studies here at UCLA. Professor Waxman's research focuses on the conflict over Israel-Palestine, Israeli politics and foreign policy, U.S.-Israel relations, American Jewry's relationship with Israel, Jewish politics and anti-Semitism. He is the author of dozens of scholarly articles and 4 books, most recently from 2019, The Israeli-Palestinian Conflict, What Everyone Needs to Know, published by Oxford University Press. And next to Dov, Professor Ethan Katz is an associate professor in the Department of History and director of the Center for Jewish Studies at UC Berkeley. He is a historian of modern Europe and the Mediterranean with specialties in modern Jewish history and the history of modern France and its empire. His scholarship has focused in 4 principal areas: the history of Jewish-Muslim relations, the nature of belonging and exclusion in modern France and the Francophone world, the history of Jews in colonial societies, Holocaust studies, and the relationship between the secular and religion in modern Jewish life. And his major publications include the 2015 book, The Burdens of Brotherhood, Jews and Muslims from North Africa to France, a wonderful book that has been the winner of numerous awards, including the National Jewish Book Award. Other works include Secularism in Question, Jews and Judaism in Modern Times from 2015, and Colonialism and the Jews from 2017. Welcome.
Thank you.
And welcome to everyone in person and on Zoom. So I will be moderating what is really a conversation between Professors Waxman and Dov and Katz, but I will be guiding with a series of questions, and I think we'll be taking a somewhat informal approach with me asking questions and each answering as they desire and responding to each other, and therefore having a conversation with you. We will speak from the table for about 45 minutes and then open up the room for comments and conversation and questions. So I have divided my questions into two parts. The first concerns the roots of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, including some definitional terms. And the second really looks to the post-October 7th period and the ongoing war to think about much more immediate manifestations of these phenomena. So I want to start with the broadest possible question, which is to ask you both to offer your own version of a storyline of how anti-Zionism has evolved over time. And I will be very curious to hear how your accounts differ, and we will encourage you to reflect on those differences. But perhaps how anti-Zionism has evolved over time, particularly with reference to anti-Semitism. Ethan, do you want to start?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you so much for that warm introduction, Sarah. Thank you, Dov, for inviting me. Thanks to all the staff for making this event possible. And thanks to all of you for being here in person or online. So, yeah, as you both know, I've kind of been running around the country giving a presentation on anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, which has caused me to try to think a lot about their historical relationship. And what I've argued is that we can see kind of two very broad strands historically of anti-Zionism. One is what I refer to as critical anti-Zionism. And critical anti-Zionism can be seen primarily from a certain number of Jewish thinkers who have offered a different political vision, sometimes a different political vision of what Jewish politics should look like broadly, but often a different political vision of what things should look like on the ground in what we now call Israel, or Israel and Palestine, or Israel-Palestine. And so we can see another sort of strand of this critical anti-Zionism from a significant number of Palestinian nationalist thinkers as well. And what characterizes this strand of anti-Zionism is that it's often fiercely critical of the way the Zionist movement is playing out, but it doesn't usually fundamentally reject the basic tenets of Zionism as a movement for some form of Jewish collective rights and self-determination in Jewish historic homeland, right? The second strand is what I call negationist anti-Zionism. And that strand is different because it does generally reject the basic tenets of Zionism. Sometimes it calls, after the founding of the state and up to the present, for the end of the state of Israel. And while critical anti-Zionists generally will say very explicitly that they're not against Jews, that they're not anti-Semitic, and we can argue sometimes, there are heated arguments about certain versions of critical anti-Zionism and whether it crosses over into anti-Semitism. Negationist anti-Zionism is certainly not always something we could characterize as anti-Semitic, but it's more prone to that. It sometimes adopts anti-Semitic tropes in the ways that it characterizes Zionism or characterizes Israel. So just to give a little bit more of a historical gloss, in terms of critical anti-Zionism, we can see a whole range of Jewish movements that call themselves anti-Zionist or non-Zionist, starting in the early 20th century, that were clearly and sometimes they came from very prominent leading Jewish figures. They were clearly not anti-Semitic in any way. We had a prominent, if small, anti-Zionist organization in the United States that was an offshoot of the Reform movement, the American Council for Judaism, in the middle of the 20th century. And it rejected the idea that Jews were a nation. It rejected explicitly the idea that anti-Zionism could in any way be anti-Semitic, and actually called Zionism anti-Semitic because it ethnicized Jews. So if we want to come up to the present, we could take a group like J Street, which would never characterize itself as anti-Zionist, but has frequently been characterized as anti-Zionist, and has built part of its message around a very critical posture toward Israel, calling itself pro-Israel and pro-peace. There's an emotional component to this, right? All of these different strands in the Jewish context, they might express a certain kind of anger, but they often come from a place of love or hope, right? Whereas a different kind of anti-Zionism comes sometimes from a place of a hardened kind of hatred, right? So while some Arab Palestinian nationalists over the years, including, I would say, Said, have had a sort of critical posture, there's also been a strand that has been just rejecting the entire Zionist project. So that's one important strand of the negationist anti-Zionism. And just to finish up, sorry to go on a little bit long, it's also important, I think, to note that positionalities matter in this story. If we talk about negationist anti-Zionists, and then we talk about even the most strident versions of Arab Palestinian anti-Zionism, that often typically comes from a place of people who have personally experienced violence and dispossession at the hands of Zionism or the Israeli state. Whatever we end up thinking of the proposals or the sentiments expressed, it's important to remember that where you sit often determines where you stand, so to speak. There's another strand of negationist anti-Zionism that really begins with Soviet anti-Zionism in the 50s and 60s, and I think is reflected in certain strands today of the far left that don't necessarily have any familial or personal connection to the Middle East, and that take up anti-Zionism as a cause that they claim is aligned with anti-racism, anti-imperialism, sort of all fights against oppression. And I think that there are important differences in the way those are conceptualized and what they really mean. So I think, historically we have several strands, but I think if we think about the relationship to anti-Semitism, it's important to differentiate between people who are very critical but not rejecting Zionism altogether, and people who are basically just negating the entire project.
Okay, thank you. So I'm also going to give a long answer, if I may, maybe even longer. I think it is, I agree with Ethan. I think it's really important to not think about anti-Zionism as this monolith, as a kind of singular, static, ideology, and rather to kind of disaggregate Zionism and to think of it, and to use the word Ethan used, as in terms of different as comprising multiple strands. But I would actually go further than just two strands, and I would divide it in the distinctions I would draw less upon kind of the type of thinking, more intellectual distinctions among anti-Zionists, and more in terms of the different communities, the different traditions within different communities. So as Ethan did, I'd certainly identify one being Jewish anti-Zionism, which in and of itself is also heterogeneous. There are, anything from the Naturai Carta to the most kind of secular, liberal, or left-wing Jews. So Jewish anti-Zionism is itself a very, very diverse tradition, but that is one tradition. And I think oftentimes people focus, for a variety of reasons, on Jewish anti-Zionism to say, well, obviously anti-Zionism can't be anti-Semitic. There are Jews who are anti-Zionist, and that doesn't really get to the fact that there are other traditions. So the other second tradition I would point to is Palestinian anti-Zionism, as Ethan did, which is almost as old as Jewish anti-Zionism. If Jewish anti-Zionism was like immediate reaction to Zionism, Palestinian anti-Zionism emerges soon afterwards. And within that tradition, I think we can find both elements of anti-Semitism, anti-Semitic voices, like Haj Amin al-Husseini, the preeminent Palestinian nationalist leader during the interwar period, but obviously also non-anti-Semitic Palestinians like Edward Said. I then would make a slight distinction and add to that Arab anti-Zionism, the broader attitude towards Zionism in the Arab world, which is related to Palestinian anti-Zionism, but I think in many ways Palestinian anti-Zionism is a direct reaction to displacement and dispossession in a way that is not the case in the wider Arab world, where anti-Zionism has functioned more as a kind of ideology of othering Jews, but we'll get into that. Then I would go beyond that and talk about Muslim anti-Zionism, because I think that has its own specific, so I'm talking about Islamism particularly, going back to somebody like Rashid Rida in the turn of the century, through Said Qutb and more recent clerics. So that's another distinct tradition of anti-Zionism. I'm going to continue, if you're all following me. Then I think we can also talk about Black anti-Zionism within the African American community, which again I think has its own specific tradition, going back to the late 60s, but particularly fed by a belief that the oppression of African Americans in the United States, the experience of systemic racism, parallels the experience of Palestinian Arabs. That's built on a particular kind of understanding of their shared struggle. And then far left anti-Zionism, and finally far right anti-Zionism, which we often don't talk about. We often nowadays just equate anti-Zionism with the left, and we forget about the fact that there's a long, very undistinguished tradition of anti-Zionism on the right and on the far right, white supremacists like David Duke. So what I'm emphasizing then in making all of these distinctions is that, like Zionism, which is a diverse movement which has many different strands and anti-Zionism is also a very diverse movement which has many, many different strands. And I think recognizing that diversity helps to push back against the kind of simple conflation of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, because once you think about how diverse and different this movement is, comprised of all of these different groups, and which are adopting anti-Zionism for different reasons at different times, then it becomes, I think, obviously very simplistic to simply equate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism as some do today.
Thank you both. So we've got a 7-tier and a 2-tier here. Ethan, that's exactly what I was going to invite you to do.
So, I mean, very helpful, very erudite. I thought about not as many communities as you did when I was sort of trying to figure out a framework of analysis for this. And I think we both would agree that part of our problem in our current conversation, and part of the reason that we're sort of throwing these things out here for thought and discussion, is that there's very little scholarship on anti-Zionism as such. It's quite remarkable what a paucity there is of any kind of serious scholarship, and it's a term that if I were to take a survey in this room, I'm quite sure there would be for every 10 people, 7 or 8 different meanings ascribed to anti-Zionism. So the reason, I guess my question about an approach like this is, absolutely it shows us that we cannot equate anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, but we want to get beyond that realization, right? And so what I tried to do was to come up with a framework that at least gets us more to the heart of the matter in terms of, what does it mean to be very critical of the Zionist project, but potentially take up positions that actually are minority Zionist positions historically, like binationalism, right? Versus what does it mean to just completely reject the Zionist project out of hand, and where on this map of communities can we identify strands that fundamentally fall into one of those buckets or the other. Again, critical anti-Zionists, they can't always be said to be not anti-Semitic, and certainly negationist anti-Zionists, as I call them, they're not all people who embrace anti-Semitism, but the overlap in the latter case is far greater than in the former case. And sometimes I think the categories help us also to sort out, So I mentioned the example of Edward Said, right? It was a surprise to me, right, in working on this, to see how clear-cut Said was about showing his sympathy for the Zionist project fundamentally and what it has meant to Jews, for the fact that Said, for a period, was actually a very strong supporter of the two-state solution, what he writes in the preface to his 1992 edition of The Question of Palestine, his classic book on the topic. And that really, even when he became a one-stater, he still talked about self-determination for both peoples, right? So what I think is the benefit of having a more conceptually based approach is that it gives us tools with which to evaluate individual thinkers and movements and how close or far they are from something like anti-Semitism.
I'm struck that neither of you spoke about religious Jewish anti-Zionism. That doesn't really fall into either of your taxonomies.
Well, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, no, I certainly, when I was talking about Jewish anti-Zionism, I think that encompasses a range of positions from, the ultra-Orthodox rejection to the most secular. So yeah, Jewish anti-Zionism, I mean, we have, on the one hand, like the Neturei Karta, and we have like Jewish Voice for Peace. They're both anti-Zionist groups. So absolutely. And I would actually say that I don't think just because Jews articulate anti-Zionism that necessarily means that they're immune from anti-Semitism.
Correct.
Right? They can be also I mean, when we think about anti-Semitism, it's the well from which we all draw, like it's embedded in our culture. So it's not just some particular people who we're all subject, we're all liable to draw upon that, especially if we don't know what anti-Semitism looks like or how it operates or what tropes and stereotypes. So I think just by pointing to Jewish that doesn't mean they're free of anti-Semitism, but it is important to recognize that Zionism for many, many years was it was a minority position before Israel's establishment. After Israel's establishment and the Holocaust became the hegemonic position within world Jewry. And I think now it's losing that hegemony. And there's a growing debate now among Jews, both, along the religious spectrum, right? Reform Jews were once anti-Zionist. Now the Reform movement's strongly Zionist, right? But I was reading an article the other day, was like Reform seminaries are kind of struggling with what are they going to do with young rabbinical students who aren't Zionist? So these questions are actually resurfacing in Jewish life.
Yeah, I mean, I would quickly just say, I mean, so of course, as you know well, though, historically there were many more than the Neturei Karta who were religious Jews who were anti-Zionists, right? One of the reasons that Rav Yitzhak Kook is such an important figure is because he's this incredibly learned and serious Torah scholar and Orthodox Jew who has a sort of theory of how religious Judaism in its most traditional way is compatible with a notion of modern Zionism, right? The basic idea traditionally had been that Jews could not emigrate en masse to the land of Israel in the absence of the coming of the Messiah, right? So it's a really kind of theological innovation in a series of thinkers in the beginning of the 19th century who try to kind of work their way through how that could be adapted. But for a very long time, Haredi Jews, right, what we describe as more right-wing Orthodox Jews, were really openly quite anti-Zionist. Now that their position has evolved. But so, I mean, I would put all those people, though, basically in a critical anti-Zionist camp. They are not against, certainly, the idea of a Jewish state being established in time. Would be extremely hard to call them anti-Semitic. Neturei Karta is a, really fringe and radical element, and I think it's a totally different, bucket. But so I would generally put those people who are religious anti-Zionists historically in the critical camp.
So it seems to me it's striking that both of you turn to Edward Said as a touch point here. Towering intellectual, has been so influential in defining so many of the terms that surround this conversation and this set of political complexities. I wonder if we think about a timeline of anti-Zionism as a phenomenon and how anti-Semitism does or does not weave through it. Does Said's own arc reflect some kind of crucial inflection point not in terms of his life per se, but world events? Or would you look to a longer kind of timeline? And are there flashpoints that you would turn to? Or, as is somewhat implicit in what both of you say, do we see across a long spectrum, over a century, do we see forms of anti-Zionism shifting and morphing, and proponents of anti-Zionism shifting and morphing, and along with them, anti-Semitism weaving in and out, depending on moment, community, speaker, thinker, and so forth?
Yeah, so I guess it's a very interesting question. I think I wouldn't take a teleological view in believing that somehow, over time, the, anti-Semitic elements have been discarded. I think rather, it's precisely because it is a movement opposing a political movement predominantly comprised of Jews, right? There's always the tendency. There's always that the tendency, the risk of anti-Semitism in various ways, either in terms of the ideas that people invoke to oppose Zionism, or the ways in which it actually operates on the ground to target Zionists. So, for example, I mentioned already in the interwar period, somebody like Hajime al-Husseini, and somebody who definitely drew on anti-Semitic tropes and stereotypes, and then also actively assisted the Nazi war effort. But then we can I think maybe some of that element subsides during the kind of heyday of secular Palestinian nationalism. And I think, if you look at the PLO did try and really make pain. I'm not defending everything the PLO did. It is important to stipulate, by saying something's not anti-Semitic, it doesn't mean to say you agree with it. It's fine. But I think the PLO tried to, but then you have, so I think part of it is the influence of Islamism, that on Hajime al-Husseini, and then, Hamas, because that does tend to introduce a more anti-Semitic element. So I think, Palestinian nationalism, there are these different elements. I think in Edward Said's time, particularly, that was when, that was kind of a possibility of a more liberal Zionism as well. And so I think that did influence how he thought about the possibilities for coexistence between Jews and Palestinians in Israel-Palestine. Nowadays we see, Said's position, and not just Said, I mean another one, Rashid Khalidi, right? They are the most moderate. They would be kind of the moderate apologist wing of the Palestinian. I mean, because they don't actually believe that Jews have no collective rights in Palestine, or they don't totally reject. They recognize there's no Holocaust denial or anything. So, I think like any political movement, whether it's Palestinian or Jewish or Zionist, is dynamic. It has these different elements, and in different circumstances, they can draw on anti-Semitism, sometimes deliberately, to mobilize. And maybe we're seeing, and I think Hamas has done that at various points. And that's a constant temptation, if you like.
Yeah. So, yeah, I agree and disagree with some things that Dov said. That's why this is fun, right? So, I mean, a different way of tracking some kind of trajectory is maybe to say what have been moments where it seemed most possible for Zionism to be compatible with some form of Palestinian self-determination, right? And so some of the moments that you're just talking about, right? Some of the, where, I mean, so if we look at when the PLO is born in the 60s, I would be less charitable toward their charter than Dov is, in that they say explicitly that Zionism must be banished from the land, and the Jews that can stay are the Jews who were there before the British Mandate. That's not very many Jews by the 60s, okay? And, when they talk about banishing Zionism from the land, it sounds like they basically mean banishing all Zionists from the land. It's a pretty apocalyptic vision for the Jewish world in the mid-60s, less than 20 years removed from the end of the Shoah. So, I mean, they say in there that they disavow all forms of racism and discrimination, but it doesn't seem very meaningful when you get down to what their what they're doing, what they're saying, and then also what they're doing, right? I mean, the PLO is not the most extreme Palestinian organization in the 70s and 80s, but they are involved in a number of terror attacks that target Jewish civilians also, right? So I think, but to come back to the point about how things evolve, right? 1988, Yasser Arafat makes this statement where he basically accepts the idea of a Palestinian state in Gaza and the West Bank, right? And so that it's easy to forget now, was quite a revolutionary moment. And at a moment like that, even harsh critiques of Zionism were happening within a framework of different possibilities that now, for many people, really seem foreclosed. I agree with what you said about how Said and Rashid Khalidi now seem really like they're really the moderate wing of Palestinian nationalism in terms of what they express, and that is notable because Rashid Khalidi has been the most important scholar, probably living scholar of Palestinian nationalism, and comes from a family that has been involved in the Palestinian National Project for over a century. And so, but I wouldn't, you gave the example of they don't engage in any Holocaust denial. There are a number of very hardcore anti-Zionist Palestinian nationalists today, or writers today who wouldn't engage in Holocaust denial, but I do become worried about how erasive they are of other elements of Jewish history, and basically completely negating any kind of legitimate Jewish claim, either implicitly or explicitly, to Jews' historic homeland in Israel and Palestine, right? Completely negating the Jewish experience of the conflict as a part of a really complex history, and telling a story that is a very sort of single-minded story about Jews as conquerors and oppressors in the land only. So I don't think one has to go all the way to Holocaust denial to be in an area that becomes rather problematic as a form of anti-Zionism.
So I'm going to ask two more questions of these foundational sort of taxonomic visions, and then maybe we'll move on after I ask those questions to thinking about the more recent chapter in a post-October 7th world. I'm struck, Ethan, your emphasis is really on tenor when you think about how to categorize. Dov, yours is communitarian. Is there any value in thinking instead about posture? And by posture, I mean, is an anti-Zionist articulation, is it racialist or racist? Is it philosophical? Is it ethical? Is it political in the sense that you might make an argument that you would call would be the pretense would be it would be a defense of a democratic, non-sectarian state idea? Could it be retributional? Could we think about anti-Zionism as breaking down in different forms than you have outlined? So that's the first stage of question. And the second stage of question is whether, in a world so influenced by social media, does any of this matter? Do the lines inevitably become porous to the point of invisibility? And do these distinctions start to fall away? Which produces something possibly far messier, harder to categorize, and also more explosive.
These are very good questions, Sarah. Thank you.
Good.
Yeah, I mean, so I think you're right. I mean, I would say tenor often overlaps with posture in a certain way, right? But I think if I understand your question, I think part of it is also about what is the programmatic meaning of anti-Zionism, right? It's one thing for someone to say, I don't think Israel had any right to be founded in 1947. I think those events were horrific. No, I don't think it should be wiped off the map. I'm going to wipe countries off the map. Like, I'm just telling you that I think it was really wrong, and we should be doing what we can to right it. That's ultimately, and the person might be fierce about their critique of the past and the present, but ultimately what the implications of that view is very different than the person who says, Israel shouldn't have been founded and it shouldn't exist, and we should do everything we can to make it go away, right? So in that regard, I do think that I think those distinctions are really important, right? And I guess in some ways I'm trying to draw out implications when I make the distinction that I do, but I think a big challenge today, a big problem today, frankly, in terms of a discursive debate versus any kind of focus on changing things on the ground, is most anti-Zionists that we hear, I don't think have a clear political program. I think that they are, they're understandably angry and critical. Sometimes we could even, say that their anger has ossified into a kind of hatred of the Zionist project. But it's not always clear that they actually want Israel to go away. I mean, just to tell an anecdote, a colleague of mine working on similar issues, talked to a very anti-Zionist friend of hers, and the person was joining in chants at rallies that many people find to be very much in the negationist anti-Zionist camp, chants of intifada, chants of from the river to the sea. And she said, just so you understand, like for a lot of Jews, it sounds like you're saying like Israel should just go away. And he was like, oh, well, I assume Israel's not going away. I assume everyone knows Israel's not going away. That's not what I mean by those chants. Of course not, right? But it was instructive in terms of the fact that, what people have actually thought through as a political program. Like, I mean, another question is to say, like, when is anti-Zionism fundamentally a protest, and when is it a program for change and potentially a program for destruction? I think the question of what is your end game is a really important question for figuring out when anti-Zionism means what. Social media, hard to know where to start with that. Stay away from it. Yeah, I mean, I take the point. In some ways, though, I actually think the distinctions matter more, because I think people should be making choices about the words and the images they use on social media. And they should be thinking, in some ways, to go back to what I just said, they should be thinking, okay, what's my end game here? What's my goal? And what are people going to infer is my goal from the words or the images that I use? Does it sound like I'm really critical and I'm angry and I want there to be change? Or does it sound like I'm for destruction, right? So I actually think social media, I mean, it's true, people read too quickly. There's all kinds of, people do memes instead of analysis. And I get all that. But I guess I feel like when we're even reading quickly, certain kinds of words should strike us in very different ways.
I'll start backwards from the social media part. I agree with Ethan's point. I mean, I think, but this is obviously, we're academics, so we're in the business of making distinctions and insisting on the importance of that. Unsurprisingly, I think it's very important, even more so today, because I think there is a really concerted effort to conflate anti-Zionism and antisemitism, and to say it's all one and the same, and to or conversely to say anti-Zionism is never anti-Semitic. So I think the fact that on social media the debate is so polarized between what I call the kind of conflators who equate the two, and the deniers who insist that there's never any connection, that actually I think it's really important to be able to introduce the kinds of distinctions that we're trying to do. And I do agree with Ethan as well that one way of thinking of making distinctions between different varieties of anti-Zionism is to think about them in prescriptive terms. And to say, I would agree that if the prescription of an anti-Zionist is that I couldn't care less what happens to Israeli Jews and they should all leave and go home or whatever, that is anti-Semitic. If there is no any version of anti-Zionism, in my opinion, that does not uphold equal rights. I mean, at the heart of the concept of anti-Semitism as a movement was the denial of equal rights for Jews, that after Jews attained equal rights, trying to strip them of that. So any political project or program that I think seeks to strip rights away from Jews and deny equal rights. That doesn't mean to say Jews have to have the right to self-determination and Palestinians don't. You can say neither, just a secular state, but it has to have equal rights. But I think I want to kind of go back to the question of like, how would I think about where it's at? Because what I was suggesting is not that we should think of it in communitarian terms, like this community is anti-Semitic, this isn't. Rather that we should apply the same questions to thinking about when it becomes anti-Semitic as we would about anything. So in various ways. So what makes something, if it's either motivated by anti-Semitism, that's most obviously. So some people might genuinely use anti-Zionism as a way of masking their anti-Semitism. I'm sure that is true for some people. It's more convenient to be an anti-Zionist than to be an outright anti-Semite. That doesn't mean to say it's true for most anti-Zionists, but that's one. More commonly, I think, is when anti-Zionists wittingly or not invoke anti-Semitic tropes and stereotypes or conspiracy theories. And that, again, that's not a question of necessarily them being hardcore anti-Semites, but just because these ideas are kind of in the air or in our culture. And so it's very easy, especially if you don't know about these tropes and stereotypes or conspiracy theories, to invoke them. And then the third one, I think in some ways, historically, the most frequent is not about what people is their intentions. We've been talking about a lot about intentions and what views do they have in mind, but rather in terms of the actions. And I think, the strongest case that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitic, even though I don't think that, but the strongest case for it is the history of anti-Zionism in practice in the Soviet Union, in the communist bloc, in Arab countries, across the Middle East, and the way in which, when anti-Zionism has been adopted as a political program, it's often ended up targeting Jews and being anti-Semitic in practice. So I think that's another way to think. That means we don't need to think about it doesn't really matter so much what people might say they want, right? They might say they care about this, that, and the other, but what matters is also how they actually treat Jews. And so it might be that, you might have an anti-Zionist with the purest of intentions who absolutely recognizes all of the things that you're talking about and want, but in practice ends up targeting Jews as Jews. In other words, not just Jews because they're Zionists. And in that case, it doesn't matter what their intention are. So, and I think that's often been the case historically. And so, which again, just goes to show how when you're dealing with a political issue that concerns Jews, it's very easy to end up being anti-Semitic. Right. Just as, and then I'll shut up, just as if you're dealing with a political issue that concerns Muslims, it's very easy to be Islamophobic, right? Because these are, embedded discourses in our culture. So so I think there's a parallel there. When people oppose Islamism, they can often do so in Islamophobic ways. When people oppose Zionism, they can often do so in anti-Semitic ways. That doesn't mean to say all of them are, but I think that's how I would see it.
Okay. Well, there are a million threads that I wish that I could follow up on, but I want to guide our conversation to the post-October 7th moment, and we can always return to some of these themes later. I would be interested to ask what has changed since that moment. It's the broadest question, but in a way it's the most fundamental. And I could imagine going through your list of 7 categories, your list of 2, thinking about perspectives. I think one thing that would be very interesting to talk about is the progressive left, but it's not the only interesting angle to take. So perhaps I will simply leave it open and to ask you to offer some reflections about how the nature of anti-Zionism, the intersecting nature of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism have evolved in the wake of October 7th. And during and in the face of an ongoing war.
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, I think I do believe that things have changed in important ways. The broadest way that I think one might think about it is that anti-Zionism, the debates around anti-Zionism and its relationship to anti-Semitism, they've been live debates for a long time. They've been heated debates for a long time. I think they have come to take on truly existential significance for both Israelis and many Jewish Zionists and Palestinians and many closely connected to Palestinians. And the reason that I say that is for Israelis and for many people deeply attached to Israel, they experience October 7th as not only, horrible and traumatic, but in part horrible and traumatic because it opened such a sense of vulnerability about the future of the Jewish state, about the security of the Jewish state. I heard Yossi Klein Halevi, someone who has made a lot of his career, as a sort of centrist Zionist advocating for coexistence with Arabs in different ways, talking in a powerful way about how the future of the Jewish state in the Middle East depends upon the capacity of Israel for military deterrence. And that was completely shattered on October 7th from his standpoint. And therefore, Israel's fighting an existential war. You can reject that logic. You can say he's wrong. You can say Israelis are incorrect to think about the war that way. But it is a very widespread view and experience for Israelis and for many American Jews and many people connected to Israelis is to feel that the moment is existentially threatened. And therefore, anti-Zionism that is strident, that is harsh, that sounds like it dismisses Jewish perspectives, that sounds like it is attacking Israel, is experienced for some as a kind of existential threat wrapped up in the violence of October 7th and this ongoing moment. And by the same token, we have a war going on in Gaza that is being experienced as an existential threat for very understandable reason by Palestinians. It is being experienced by many as a second Nakba, the term for the catastrophe of 1948 for Palestinians, or as at least potentially the preface to an impending second Nakba. It's been an extraordinarily destructive war already in terms of physical destruction and horrific loss of life. So for Palestinians, that means that the need to critique Israel is of existential importance. The need to be able to talk for many of them about an ongoing genocide as they see it in Gaza. I don't personally support that as an analytical term for what's going on in Gaza, but I understand where it's coming from. And I understand that the need to be able to be very harsh and descriptive about a horrific situation is burning for Palestinians. And so the accusation that this anti-Zionism is anti-Semitic is, in a sense, to threaten the basic right to speak about something that is so profoundly threatening and is in itself feels almost like an existential threat to the ability of Palestinians to speak politically in a moment of such pain and vulnerability. So I think that we have raised the stakes of this debate exponentially in this moment for both sides. And I think that's in many ways the biggest shift, and it helps to account for, I think, just how harsh a lot of the rhetoric has become.
Before you take the mic, can you expand on one thing? You just said we raised the stakes.
Yes.
How would you understand the actors there? How would you understand the we? Almost everyone who really cares about the conflict, who really cares about one side in the conflict, feels that the stakes around these debates are now much greater, right? So, I'm sorry, I'm going to go to campuses for a second because I still think it's a situation that I know best. So if we talk about the chants at rallies, if we talk, from the rivers to the sea, which is one of the more complicated chants if we look at the history of it and how it lands, but we know that it lands for many, many, many Jews and Israelis as a call, not only for an end to the Israeli state, but for a Jew-free land. We know that historically that is not the primary meaning for Palestinian nationalists, that it has to do with some kind of liberation struggle, maybe indeed, an end to the current political situation where Israel is there, but some kind of a democratic, secular state that allows Palestinians to return. I think the way that is heard by Jews who feel so vulnerable is now that it is an endorsement of October 7th and of a continuing campaign of extermination against Jews, which they regard as
what October 7th was part of. And for Palestinians, it is heard as the absolutely necessary cry of a people who've been oppressed for all these years, who is simply desperate for their freedom and is now being demonized for calling for their freedom, as if that call for freedom is by definition a defense of Hamas.
Thank you.
Okay, well, first of all, I think it's what Ethan did is absolutely right. When we think about the meaning of these terms and the debate over anti-Zionism, it is important, I think, to really think about what it means for Palestinians and Israelis living in Israel-Palestine. And often over here, we can kind of have this debate. Sometimes it's a bit abstract and it's divorced from their actual experience of what anti-Zionism means for Israeli Jews, particularly, and how they understand it, and what Zionism means for Palestinians. And so I agree that, first of all, we should generally foreground their kind of lived experience. And also, I think you're absolutely right that for both communities, it is now seen in existential terms. And so the stakes are immeasurably higher post October the 7th. I would shift to think about what it means outside of Israel-Palestine for a minute, because one of the things I think we've seen is that this is not just of great significance and even existential significance to Palestinians and Israelis, but is also to many around the world, and certainly many Jews, many Palestinian Americans, Muslim Americans, Arab Americans. One thing I think we've seen, so I think in general, the stakes for diaspora communities or communities, people who identify, are also immeasurably higher. And I think one thing for myself, as I thought about this, on the one hand, we've seen, to use Ethan's typology, we've seen that what we might have thought was critical anti-Zionism is there's actually a lot more negationist anti-Zionism out there. And, so that's been a kind of a wake-up call that we kind of thought, oh, this isn't a critical anti-Zionist position. Actually, there's a lot of, and so that's been something of a shock. I think the other thing, particularly for Jews who are already feeling, scared of anti-Semitism, fearful about it prior to to October the 7th, and particularly worried about, white nationalism, the realization that anti-Zionism, as they experience it, is experienced increasingly as a threat to their own safety. And so that increases the stakes of this debate. I think we need to be careful, and not saying that any time a Jewish person is offended by something, that we need to draw a distinction between harm and threat and offense. And so there's lots of things that we might find offensive and deeply insensitive over the last few months. That doesn't necessarily make it anti-Semitic. But I do think we shouldn't dismiss these feelings. And one of the things I've personally wrestled with is, like, even if anti-Zionism isn't, even if the people expressing this aren't motivated by any animus towards Jews, it's not anti-Semitic in that respect. And even if they might uphold the idea of equal rights ultimately for Israeli Jews and Palestinians, what is happening is that Zionism and Zionism is for many people being so vilified that even if it's not anti-Semitic, right, it still affects many Jews, because Jews around the world, the vast majority at least, identify as Zionists. So what we're seeing is, in practice, even the question of whether it's anti-Semitic or not isn't the only issue. It's also like the fact that people who support this ideology are regarded as completely beyond the pale and need to be cast out of kind of civilized society. That in and of itself is problematic. So the way I look at it is like, no, I don't think charging Israel, accusing Israel of Zionism, say settler colonialism, is anti-Semitic. But what we've seen on campuses sometimes and elsewhere, that people who think of Israel as settler colonial society don't necessarily have a problem with innocent civilians being butchered. So that in and of itself is one, anti-Semitic or not. That's just a serious problem. So I think we need to, in some ways, not just think about is anti-Zionism anti-Semitic, but just simply say, is this program, because it's vilified Zionists to such an extent that it's now seen in the minds of some otherwise liberal, humanistic people that it's okay to, carry or at least they kind of look the other way when civilians are being murdered. And that in itself is I think, something that we have to wrestle with.
Thank you. I want to make sure that everyone present has the opportunity to weigh in. So what I'm going to do is invite hands from the room, and I'll call on 3 people at once and give our speakers the chance to move between those questions, please.
Hi, yes. I'd like to ask Professor Katz if how you see the distinction between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism differently in France. So you've done so much work there. And in particular, I'm interested in your ideas of critical anti-Zionism and Soviet or anti-colonial anti-Zionism. What does that look like in France?
Thank you. Other questions, please?
I have a question about the categorization of anti-Zionist camps. So I think one thing that's been very noticeable to me as a college student is the way that anti-Zionism is perceived in people of my generation versus like older generations. So do you think there's a generational divide of anti-Zionism, and how would you sort of characterize that in terms of like dividing it up?
So for the online audience, we'll need you to repeat the questions.
Okay, perfect, thank you. We'll take one more, and then as you answer, perhaps you can repeat the question. Was there another hand in the back? Yes, please, all the way in the back.
Hi, thank you for this. I wanted to ask about the discussion surrounding double standards that Israel has held to a unique and different standard than most other nations, and to what extent could we historically attribute that to anti-Semitism or to something else, and if that's changed post 10/7.
Thank you so much. So perhaps I will do my best to summarize the 3 questions, and then you can reflect. I'm sorry if I don't do the speakers full justice here. But the first set of questions was about for Ethan Katz, was about the landscape in France in particular, and the tenor of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. And I think you're referring both to a longer history and to the post-October 7th moment. Thank you. And the second question regards the very interesting query as to whether there is a generational dimension to the embrace of anti-Zionism. I think you're referring to the United States, but perhaps not.
The U.S. in particular. But I think
the U.S. in particular, great. And then lastly, a question about about how to unpack the accusation of a double standard in addressing Israel's right to exist. So please reflect on whatever you wish.
Right. All good questions. I mean, on the French case, I think there's actually, in some ways, a much older and more widespread history since, in some ways, the 1980s, but in particular, since the early 2000s, of obliterating the line between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. So in France in the 1970s, when there were sort of early movements for labor rights for migrant Arab workers, they would, even in some of the same publications that valorized the Fedayeen, the so-called freedom fighters of groups like the PLO, they would still say, long live Palestine, long live the anti-Zionist Jews, right? They were really trying to make clear that they were not anti-Semitic. By the early 80s, you have rallies during the First Lebanese War where they chant death to the Jews, right? And then you see that, I mean, part of what happens is that the experience of Arab workers, first of all, they're Arab. There are far more Arab workers, primarily from North Africa, in France than there are in, say, a place like the United States. So they already have an ethnic kinship. Most of them are Muslim. The majority of Palestinians are Muslim, so they often have a religious kinship. And geographically, they are far closer physically where they live. So there is much earlier a sense that their struggle for rights is playing out, and they see the Palestinian struggle as a kind of metaphor for their own struggle. And so very often they come to take up a very strident position, and they see Jews in France frequently as a privileged group, analogous to what they see as the power of Zionism, right? So that's a really an older discourse, and it's part of the crisis really of Jews and Muslims that emerges by the early 21st century in France. So I'm not sure how much it's really changed post October 7th. The question about the generational divide, I think it's absolutely fundamental. I mean, I think one way of thinking about it is that I think most Jews and many sort of liberals of my parents' generation and their parents' generation assumed at a basic level that the Zionist project is just, that the establishment of an Israeli state is a just, good thing. Have lots of criticisms, but that they sort of took for granted. That is not taken for granted, I think, by large numbers of the generation of American Jews that's coming of age today. And so each group, in a way, I think really feels, to use a phrase I don't particularly like, but I think most people in the room are familiar with it now, gaslighted by the other, in the sense of, like, for that older generation, that you don't at least say up front, of course we know Israel has a right to exist, is so unnerving. And for the younger generation, the fact that you don't start off by saying, of course, Israel is doing some terrible things and the occupation is wrong. So you have, I think, these sort of basic premises that each generation wants the other to accept that are just not obvious to the counterpart generation. On double standards, it's a complicated question. I think double standards regarding Israel certainly can be anti-Semitic, but they're not definitionally so. There can be other reasons, like the amount of aid that the United States gives to Israel versus what it gives to other countries, or the tremendous amount of media coverage that Israel receives in the United States, or the links between evangelical Christians in the United States and Zionism. There can be other reasons for focusing disproportionate energy on Israel, but I do think it's a question that we should ask repeatedly. I mean, there are many contexts where it is bizarre, at best, why people have decided to take a tunnel vision and obsessively talk about Zionism or Israel as if it is the central injustice in the world. And that long predates October 7th. I think what's interesting post-October 7th is that the movements that we see in places like our campuses seem to have really settled upon the Palestinian struggle as the civil rights question of our time. But that probably is the outcome of a much longer term process.
So I'd start off by just amplifying what Ethan was saying about I'm not going to talk about the French context, but I think what Ethan was saying about the context in France and his book on this really underlies the importance of thinking about anti-Zionism in contexts, in specific contexts, and not decontextualize. That the way anti-Zionism operates, plays out, is articulated in a French context is specific to that context, is influenced, as Ethan wrote, by France's colonial history, the conditions of integration of French wisdoms or lack thereof. And so in each context, we need to kind of be much more attentive to context and time period. And that brings me to the second question. So I do think, absolutely a generational divide. I mean, the reason why we're talking so much about anti-Zionism today is because a younger generation of Americans, younger people around the world are embracing anti-Zionism, and it's having growing support. And in many ways, that is a response to new historical conditions, the apparent permanence of the occupation, the collapse of the peace process, the belief that there is no way to reconcile, as Ethan was saying, Palestinian rights with Zionism. All of these things have kind of given new impetus for anti-Zionism today. I think maybe most fundamental, at least within the Jewish community, and the divide that Ethan was talking about, is the distance from the Holocaust. So I think, just as the Holocaust for two generations of American Jews kind of convinced maybe previously skeptical or even Jews who were opposed to Zionism of the necessity of Zionism. It was seen as the ultimate vindication of Zionism. So the younger generation, more distance from the Holocaust, less, don't see in Zionism or Jewish statehood the existential need that Jews have for a safe haven, for a refuge, but rather see Zionism as, a kind of movement of territorial expansion and conquest, or, human rights violations. So I definitely think there's big generational divide. But again, it's not unprecedented. We've talked occasionally about the 60s and the 70s. And I think it's important when you look back, actually, that was another period of time where you had a young generation of left-wing radicals, Jewish and non-Jewish, and university campuses were, places of turmoil, where you had that generation rejecting the older, the old left and the Jewish left's ideas about Zionism. So in some ways, this is new. And in other ways, some of this harkens back to that period of, in the kind of, late 60s and 70s. Let's not forget it was in the mid 70s that the UN famously passed its resolution equating Zionism with racism. And we're having arguments today about whether Zionism, that was repealed in 1991, but now it might, if it was introduced again today, it might well pass. So it just shows that maybe it's not a kind of linear process, right, with each generation getting progressively less Zionist, but actually fluctuates in response to, concrete conditions and circumstances.
Thank you both. I'll take 2 more questions, please.
How do you explain this? So you have pro-Palestinian demonstrations around the globe among students. Why don't we see pro-Tamil demonstrations, pro-Rohingya demonstrations, pro-Chechen demonstrations, and so on? You can pick your group that wants independence. So what is the intensity on campuses focusing on Jews or Zionists versus these other cases which are equally concerning?
Thank you so much. Please.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more on Soviet anti-Zionism and how that might relate with modern intersectionalism and critical consciousness, which I feel like is very prominent, especially in social media and college circles right now.
Great, thank you. And to repeat the questions for those joining us on Zoom or the recorded version, the second question was whether in thinking about a younger generation's feelings, sentiments about anti-Zionism, if they are not informed by understandings of intersectionality and but I'm forgetting the end of your sentence, and critical consciousness. Okay, thank you. And the first question returns to a theme that was the topic of the earlier gathering at Berkeley, but we've touched upon a couple of times in thinking specifically about campus protests. Why has the cause of Palestinian rights and a protest against Israeli actions become the cause célèbre relative to other humanitarian issues that might be embraced?
So not only in campuses, across the globe, you have demonstrations. You don't have any demonstrations pro-Tamil and so on.
Thank you. And not only on campuses, but also across the globe. So I invite our speakers to respond.
So on the first question, I think in some ways that echoes the question which I didn't answer, I realize, on double standards. Why do people? I think Ethan already suggested some plausible reasons. I don't think, no doubt in some cases anti-Semitism is a factor, but these are, I think there are many reasons. I think when we try to explain what accounts for the peculiar, disproportionate, even obsessive, as to use Ethan's focus on the Israel-Palestine issues. There are many reasons. It is occurring in the territory that has great religious significance to millions, billions of people around the world. It is one of the longest run. There were countless. The media focused on. The media wasn't able to cover what happened to Tamils in Sri Lanka, for example. So I agree that there's certainly, a disproportionate focus, sometimes even double standards applied. But I think there are a number of reasons why. Not to say that anti-Semitism is never. The Jews have occupied an outsized role in the Western Christian imagination for many, many, many centuries. So it would it's not really surprising. And I mean, you know, if you think about the role that anti-Judaism has played and the Jews as a particular, that it's going to also figure into how the Jewish state is seen. And there's particularly for some this expectation that, well, because Jews and the center and the importance of the role that the Holocaust plays in Western memory, and therefore somehow Jews shouldn't behave like this. That there's a whole lot of reasons. So I'm not discounting the role of anti-Semitism, but I think it's reductionist to only explain it in terms of anti-Semitism. On the question of like more broadly, like what role does intersectionality and I think it is certainly on campus and on the left. I think it's very important in explaining why so many groups are in solidarity with the Palestinians, because there is a frame, and this is what again helps explain why these groups are engaging. That one of the things Palestinian activists have done very effectively is forge alliances, right, with other groups and really engage in that kind of growth, partly out of necessity, because they had to kind of figure out, okay, how are we going to campaign, especially in the United States, which is a broadly pro-Israel public. And so they've really, especially with the African-American community, really forged strong links, particularly after Ferguson and after 2014. And so I think that is partly a kind of, and has been an effective grassroots strategy to mobilize public support by linking the Palestinian struggle. It's not new, as I said, it was something that goes back in the 60s, but we're seeing how that's really kind of paid off, if you like, in the present moment, because there is such broad support. Whereas I think, you know, pro-Israel groups, by contrast, in the US, haven't invested in that. They have neglected that terrain, and actually, you know, have realized, therefore, that while you know there's a lot of support for Israel in certain places and obviously certain communities, there it is really not apparent in other parts of the United States.
Did you want to comment on the, or Ethan, you may expand too, on the question of the Soviet?
Sorry, I didn't mention that. No doubt, I think, I mean, it's hard to say. I think clearly we see echoes of kind of Soviet anti-Semitic, anti-Zionism in expressions of anti-Zionism today, and we can say particularly when what I would call kind of conspiracist anti-Zionism, in other words, where Zionists are portrayed as kind of this shadowy cabal, nefarious force pulling the strings of government. That, you know, which really evokes anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. That was a feature particularly of Soviet propaganda, which depicted Zionism as like these octopi, you know, tentacles all over the globe and controlling events. So there are definitely echoes of that. But at the same time, I think people often overstate the case and want to say that basically the progressive left in the West is just essentially, you know, prisoners of this anti-Semitic propaganda. They've been duped by the Soviets. They don't even realize it decades later. And I don't think that gives, first of all, I don't see the causation between, maybe on the far left, there is connections, definitely. But I think, you know, to just say it's the Soviets is very simplistic, and also doesn't take seriously the many reasons why people oppose Zionism, which has nothing to do with anti-Semitic conspiracy theories.
Thank you.
Yeah, good questions, and in some ways I think they're interconnected. I mean, I'll start with the second question because I think it helps in some ways to account for the question raised in the first question. So, I mean, I think that fundamentally the intersectionality arguments, the anti-racist campaigns that we see today, they center on ideas about structural racism, structural discrimination. Jews in America today, with very rare exception, don't face that kind of discrimination or exclusion. Attacks on Jews don't take the form of Jews being impeded from ladders of opportunity. And so anti-Semitism operates from a different logic. It sits outside of that framework. And it's one of the reasons that the concern has not been adopted, even in a moment like after the massacre in Pittsburgh, when some of us thought, okay, we see white nationalists who are the same people who have such hatred for African Americans, and look what happened to Jews. Maybe somebody's going to look up and say, oh, there's an intersectional thing here about anti-Semitism, but it didn't happen. So I think that, you know, Jews are perceived for many of these people as simply white, as not facing the kind of discrimination that is really the focus of their campaigns. And then they translate that to seeing Israel as a state that, you know, has the same kind of power and privilege over a group that in some ways, I mean, let me back up and say, I mean, there's absolutely no question that Palestinians face tremendous discrimination and oppression long before October 7th. You know, there's a huge amount to critique on human rights grounds in Israeli policy. But I think some of this is also superficial and has to do with the perception that Israel's white and that Palestinians are brown. And so, I mean, I think that is part of, unfortunately, and that goes to a little bit to the second question, right? I think that many people who focus very strongly on this conflict rather than other conflicts, it's partly because of media coverage, but that media coverage or the evangelical Christian discourse or certain American Jewish organizations have also fed, sometimes actively and deliberately, a perception about how much Americans have in common with Israelis. When we look overseas and we see another country that we think we understand them, that we think they're like us, and we see something that violates our sensibilities, we're often more likely to criticize it, I think, because somehow it offends our sensibilities in a different way, right? So in a way, I think sometimes there is a certain kind of racism, frankly, built into being much more concerned about that than being concerned about, say, a genocide going on in the Sudan, right? But I think that is part of why it resonates for people. I mean, there's no question that at times it's you know, we can see anti-Semitic tropes. We can see sort of the reservoir, as I refer to it sometimes, as I referred to in our first part of the conversation, of anti-Jewish hatreds being drawn upon in the sort of obsessive focus. Matthew Friedman wrote a piece years ago that I think it's called The Most Important Story in the World, which is still worth reading, about how much disproportionate media coverage Israel receives at times. But I think part of it is also this sense that, you know, Israel somehow is supposed to be like America, and therefore we think we understand. Sometimes understanding is actually profound misunderstanding, thinking that what's going on there is Jim Crow in the Middle East, which I think is a terrible way to really understand what's going on.
Just to add to that, one other factor is that for many outside of the United States, it's opposition to America as well, right? That the opposite anti-Zionism and anti-Americanism, anti-imperialism, it's kind of a package deal. And so in many parts of the world, because Israel is seen as like the little America, that also means that there's, you know, an outside focus. So yeah, and I think that dates back to the new left's kind of focus on Israel Palestine after 1967, because it was seen as an outpost of imperialism and an extension of American influence. And so, you know, that's why kind of it's seen as part of this broader third worldist struggle against these forces.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I think we have time for one more question, please.
Hi, thank you so much for this really enlightening and instructive discussion. My question will bring us back again to Said, and what I want to ask is, to what extent do you think it's actually instructive to think about anti-Zionism, and particularly the way in which it developed into more theoretical streams of thought as a discourse, very much as Said viewed Orientalism as a discourse, and if you don't find it instructive, then why not?
Okay, I'll.
Do you want to repeat the question?
Yes. So the question is it instructive? Is it helpful to think about anti-Zionism as a discourse in the way that we think about, say, Orientalism as a discourse that, according to Said, that constructs the object? Absolutely. Yeah. So I think that is a very helpful way of thinking about it. When I think about anti-Zionism, I think we have to think about it in both as a discourse as well as a practice. And, you know, while we often talk about it in more discursive terms, and I think and it's a shifting discourse, it's dynamic. And so the way it constructs Zionism and Zionists differs from place to place and shifts over time. But I also think that we should, while, as academics, yes, we're interested in discourse and deconstructing discourses, but we also need to pay attention to how it's operationalized and how it acts in practice. And which is to say that, sometimes we can talk about, this discourse of anti-Zionism in a very innocuous way and not pay attention to the fact it's not just intellectuals who espouse anti-Zionism. We can say this, Edward Said Khalidi, Judith Butler, whatever. It's also people on the ground who adopt it, and often in much cruder and in ways, and then end up, as we've seen over the last few months, sometimes taking it out on Jews around them. And so we need to think about it both as a discourse as well as how it's actually translated into human behavior, because I think one of the dangers, and I think many Jews are expressing this outside of Israel, is that it's leading to Jews who identify as Zionists being ostracized or excluded. And so that's an action, not necessarily the product of, but that's the result. So we need to look at both how it's changing as a discourse, as well as what it actually means in terms of actual behavior.
So I think it's a very provocative, and it's really a question we're thinking. First of all, I would just point out that, Said never saw Orientalism simply as a discourse, right? Mm. He actually argued very emphatically that Orientalism was the discourse that underlay power differentials on the ground, that underlay the practices of colonialism. So in that way, I think if you start thinking about it as a discourse and you really take Said's logic fully, then you can make some strong and some really concerning arguments about it. I mean, in a way, it goes back to the intention impact question, right? To say that there does seem to be a clear catalyst in certain kinds of anti-Zionism vis-a-vis anti-Semitic acts, right? And so I think thinking about that discourse and the way that it creates categories and the way that it creates very sharp lines for people and assumptions that they make, and then actualizes in exclusion or even violence is important. And I wonder if there's a way, again, trying to extend Said a little bit, right? One of the things to remember also about Said's notion of Orientalism is that it's a fixation. It's not always a negative fixation. It has a certain admiring quality to it. We, again, could maybe extend that to Zionism, right? I mean, I don't know what the right word is, fixation, Zionist fixationalism. I don't know what the right word is, but fetishization of Zionism, maybe, yeah. But I think we could say that there definitely can be overlap between people who admire certain aspects of the Zionist project, maybe come to have very strong notions about a certain standard that Israel should be held to, and then end up being hypercritical of the Zionist project simultaneously. So I think it's a very potentially useful thing to think with about the way Zionism and anti-Zionism are operating today.
Just to bring one final thought to add on to that, because we've been praising Said and Orientalism. I think when we think about, one of the critiques is that thinking about, he presented it as a kind of monolithic discourse, and so when we think about anti-Zionism as discourse, we shouldn't think of it like Orientalism as this monolithic, that was part of the prop. That is, it's useful to think of it as like a discursive field in which there are lots of different claims being made. It's not a kind of single discourse, because one of the problems I think that some critics of anti-Zionism, who I won't name, have when they present it as this kind of discourse, which is that it often takes out the most extreme voices so this is what anti-Zionism is this discourse, and ignores all the others. So I think, like any discourse, it is not single monolithic, and you have as you had within Orientalism, and that was part of the problem, that it tends to give this sense of there's more homogeneity than there was.
but sorry, I do think that it can have a kind of, I mean, to use a Foucaultian term, a kind of disciplining function, right? I mean, just to give sort of an example that's vivid for me from our campus from very recently, there was a student, not Jewish, Chinese, went to a poetry reading because they were interested. It was poetry reading, I think Filipino poetry, and every single poem they heard was anti-Zionist. And they were like, what's going on here? I just came to hear Filipino poetry, and I'm kind of like weirded out and disturbed by the fact that every single one of the poems I hear is attacking Israel. And then they were basically told, like, oh, you're anti-Palestinian, this is the place for you. And so I think that only can happen and seem normal and not weird, if you will, to all the people or many people in the room in a situation where there is a discursive field that has emerged, at least in certain pockets, where anti-Zionism is just taken for granted as defending the rights of the oppressed, full stop.
Well, I want to thank our guests, Professors Ethan Katz and Dov Waxman, so much for your conversation, and thank all of you.